Welcome to part 6 on the Civil War. Now we're going to talk about the home front. For Abraham Lincoln, the battlefield wasn't just out there with his generals, but also back home. He had to deal with a lot of different issues. Matter of fact, one big issue he had to deal with was what to do about Maryland. Maryland was a slave state that also laid north of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. If Maryland was to decide to go ahead and secede, then all of a sudden the Confederacy is completely surrounding the nation's capital. The nation's capital would have to be moved, and that would be a tremendous blow to the morale of the North. Matter of fact, it might be a critical one. And so what does Lincoln do? Well, what he does is he violates the Constitution, right? He suspended writs of habeas corpus on April 27th, 1861, right? This allowed agents to come in and imprison anyone in Maryland, for example, like the mayor of Baltimore, and hold them for an extended period of time without charging them with a crime, right? That's what suspending writs of habeas corpus allows you to do. Now, constitutionally, the president cannot do this. Matter of fact, it says in the Constitution that only Congress can suspend writs of habeas corpus. And a matter of fact, Congress even informs him of that, saying, you can't do this. And he goes, I know, I can't, but I'm doing it. And in total, he'll suspend writs of habeas corpus 4 times during the war. And ultimately, it's going to end up in the jailing of over 13,000 American citizens without being charged with a crime, including, as I said before, the mayor of Baltimore and the pro-secessionist components of the Maryland legislature. That's one way to make sure Maryland can't secede. Those that would vote for it, well, they're thrown in jail. Now, sure, he did these constitutional violations and he dealt with the Civil War, but there was other things Lincoln also got done during his presidency. For example, he appointed several members of the Supreme Court. Of course, he always picked abolitionists. He instituted the first ever national income tax, even though it was temporary, right? He implemented 2 international tariffs, and he created the Department of Agriculture. Elsewhere in the North, you also had the Democratic Party, right? And the Democratic Party in the North was fracturing. You had pro-war, pro-union Democrats who were in favor of the Civil War, but tried to make sure to keep a healthy distance from Lincoln himself. And then you had anti-war Democrats that would be referred to as Copperheads, who wanted the South to just be let go, right? And the South had its own share of problems as well, right? It's doing a massive mobilization of men, right? And these men are leaving, and these farms and these traditional Southern-style societies are being left to the women to operate, right? This was something that was not a common thing at this time. Women found themselves suddenly straddled with the responsibility of managing plantations, managing slaves, and even disciplining them, right? But, I mean, many of them did so with quite well. For example, one letter written by Michael Raysor, who was a Confederate soldier, he wrote to his wife and he said, "You said that you thought we would have near 100 head of hogs to fatten this fall? This is doing well, ain't it? I think you are a better farmer than I am, and you have done exceedingly well since I've left," right? So some of these women are really up for the challenge, right, in managing these farms while these men went off to fight in the war. Of course, the issue of slaves was another thing that had to be addressed during the war. Now, Lincoln had said that this war was about keeping the Union together, right? He wasn't quite ready to talk about emancipation, and he still had this rule of law thing. You know, the Constitution protects slavery, and so I can keep it from spreading, but I can't necessarily do anything about it when it's where it's already exists, right? But slaves themselves are going to take things into their own hands. During the war, over 500,000 slaves will take flight and flee to the North or flee to Union armies, right? This was really a risky proposition, especially at first, because there was no policy in place in the Union amongst generals in what to do with these slaves when they fled to their armies. Matter of fact, early in the war, a lot of times generals would get slaves flee to them. A plantation owner would show up to the Union army under a flag of truce saying, "I would like to collect my slaves, please," and the general would just give them back to him. Some tried to take action, but again, since Lincoln was trying to remain focused on Union, he often would countermand some of the actions of his generals. For example, John Fremont is now serving as a general in the Union Army. In August of 1861, he's managing Missouri, which had not seceded, right? It's still part of the Union. And he ordered that all property of rebels found in Missouri is subject to confiscation, including slaves. So he says, if you are rebellious in Missouri, I'm going to take your slaves and free them. Lincoln's going to revoke that order. Said, no, you can't do that, because if you do that, you might cause Missouri to secede. In May of 1862, General David Hunter is going to issue an order freeing all slaves from occupied areas in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Lincoln, again, is going to countermand that order, right? He is going to move towards emancipation, but at the same time, he is going to also be very focused on trying to fight for unification, right? So it won't be until the Emancipation Proclamation in late 1862 that you start to see the role of African Americans in the war changed drastically. So throughout this process, the status of slaves in the South is going to kind of just migrate from confiscation to emancipation, right? Generals are going to begin confiscating slaves. That doesn't free them. They're going to begin confiscating them because what they'll find is that the South can maintain a really high enlistment rate. The South is going to have an enlistment rate amongst whites in the South of 60%. Now, that's more than twice what the North was. But they could do that, right? Because you have slaves back home that can actually do the manual labor, right? And so the first thing you're going to see is that in August 6, 1861, Congress is going to pass the first Contraband Act, which will allow these commanders to confiscate these slaves as aid to the Confederate war effort, right? And so now they're still slaves, but they're just property under confiscation, okay? But it's going to continue, the tide towards emancipation is going to keep building, and by early or late spring to early summer of 1862, Lincoln has finally decided that it's time to pull the trigger on it. He's going to write a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, but he's going to be told, you can't release this, right? William H. Seward, his former political rival and now Secretary of State, is going to say, we have been beaten by Robert E. Lee all year long. Battle after battle, he's been victorious. And to issue an emancipation now, as much as I would love to see it, would be an act of desperation, or at least that's how it will be perceived. And so we need to wait for the right time. We need to have a great victory. And they're in late 1862, they're going to get it.